views here. There we are. So welcome everybody to today's webinar, which is about outcomes, outcomes and measurement of outcomes. So two areas I'm going to cover today. I've got to go through a little bit of admin with you. One is that you'll see a yellow hand on the left-hand side of your toolbar if you'd like to press to say you're present. And if you have any difficulties, there's a question box there. You can ask technical questions, and my colleagues in the room will try and help you with it. For the moment, as you can see, I'm on the webcam, but we're going to turn that off for the duration, basically, because we want to preserve bandwidth so you can see the screen. I think that's all the admin out of the way. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to turn off the webcam and properly explain what we're doing. So when I say this, I'm going to turn over to the next slide. And there we are. The next slide, the first slide, and there at the bottom it tells you who I am. I'm Brendan McCarron. What we're going to be talking about is outcomes. I've taken a quotation from the Northern Ireland Programme for Government. We enjoy long, healthy, active lives, which is a fairly good outcome statement. And then I've put underneath it, define enjoy. And I think that probably sums up most of the problems we have with outcomes, is that outcomes are a social construct. And as such, they are not easily definable, and if they're not definable, it's going to be difficult to measure them with any accuracy. However, to some extent, that's a red herring, because actually outcomes have many, many uses beyond simple measurement. And really what we need to talk about is all the other uses. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a sort of wide-ranging set of thoughts over the next 55 minutes or so. Do ask questions as we come along into the box, and my colleagues will pick them up. We'll try and address them as we go through. The other thing is that I'll be asking some poll questions as we go through and see what's what. It may be interesting just to go through and from the list of people who've booked on, just to go down and to look at where you come from, and the answer is across the United Kingdom. Scotland, a couple of local authorities there, NHS bodies I see booked on, so welcome to you. Quite surprising in a sense, because either you all know all this stuff on account of the work that's been done in Scotland over the years, or alternatively we're not getting to the parts we should reach. Northern Ireland, lots of a group there of non-departmental public bodies or arm's length bodies, library service, ambulances, and an academic email address knocking around there from Queen's. In Wales, I can see local authorities, police forces, and somebody from the Assembly, so welcome to you. That's an interesting turnout. And England, quite surprisingly, really. I suppose it's because you're just lots of people in England compared to the other administrations, but quite a lot of local authorities in England, and also a couple of non-departmental public bodies, and also someone from the private sector into data management and policy evaluation, which is another area where outcomes feature very highly. Just looking, no one from DFID, which is normally, whenever I talk on this subject, normally there's someone from DFID in the audience. The last time I spoke on this, and the people from Northern Ireland, forgive me if you saw this, because I was at a conference in Belfast a couple of months ago, and I did a presentation which basically is this presentation with different bits in it, but rather similar ideas, because I have some sort of similar ideas for the last 20 years on this particular subject. So I'm going to expose you to those ideas. So the first set of ideas I'm going to talk about is the reason you should do it. Now, in Northern Ireland, you might be sitting there saying, well, the reason we should do it, Brendan, is because the Programme for Government says we jolly well should do it, and similarly for Scotland, and we haven't got a choice. Actually, that's not a great reason for doing it, because actually, as we know, We don't have to do stuff. We can just pretend to do stuff. So we really need to pin down what exactly it is we're trying to achieve here with outcomes and taking an outcome approach. I've sketched out a couple of things here on this particular slide. Planning, for instance, on the left, and then deployment on the right, by which I mean actually doing the work. Some of this language will become clearer as we go through, but it's a kind of checklist of stuff that is a good starting point for having a discussion in your organization about why you should be thinking about using outcomes to help you to manage public money and to achieve better outcomes and better impacts on society, set up on that slide there. We'll probably come back to some of these ideas later. There's another slide that comes up here, and again, if you were going back and to look at the hard copy of this or look at the webinar, these are here for checklists for you, if you like. It's just experience about how people use these things between starting up and how they get more mature in their use. So our colleagues from Scotland, for instance, should be on the right-hand side of this, whereas people setting out and starting this would be on the left-hand side. And you can see that when you're starting out, it's incredibly useful to have an outcomes approach because it really does begin to give you some insight into what your organization is trying to achieve, and also what your organization is trying to achieve through others, because you can start to interpret and separate out these age-old questions about what's an outcome, what's an output, and what is it that I'm actually doing, what are my services doing to impact on the plan for outcomes. And most organizations starting out would use outcomes in that way. When you get better, then you can start doing some sexier things around prioritizing the mission level or the longer term outcomes, and doing a proper theory of change, which some of you come from a development background will have heard about. And actually in the paper this morning I heard something about theory of change Scotland, didn't I? It was about, I know what it was about. It was about the education in Scotland. The national curriculum in Scotland is not very good, and that they've just been told to get a different theory of change. So whoever wrote that clearly was thinking of outcomes and possibly used to work for DFID. Now then, still on the right-hand side, you see there's a word there that we may as well define here. Enablers aligned to outcomes. An enabler, as it's defined at the bottom, services, assets, infrastructure, intangibles, whatever it is that enables the optimum impact on outcomes is an enabler. And that would be across a partnership network. So to give you an example, I was working with, some years ago, 5 or so years ago, started working with the Risk Management Authority in Scotland, and they were trying to persuade people to look at the way they risk assess very dangerous criminals. And in fact, it was quite clear that the outcome shouldn't be on the dangerous criminal to start with. It should have been on the correctional staff in prisons who had to do things differently and had to think and interact with prisoners differently in order to reduce risk. So though risk was the ultimate aim, the mission level outcome, if you like, you had to actually have outcomes about changing the way in which partners worked. So that's why the definition of enablers incorporates this idea about making sure that you're changing the way things are done across a partnership network. It's probably a good point at this stage, before I start going through a bit of a background stuff about where these things come from, to look at a couple of our poll questions here. And the first question is very, very simple. Is your organization strategic plan outcome based? So let's paraphrase that question a bit and say, do you think you have an organizational strategy in your organization which is based on outcomes? So does it explicitly talk about outcomes? And you've got 3 choices there. So I'm just going to launch this for you, and 3 choices are wholly outcome-based to some extent, which I would guess about 50-50, and not at all, which is anything from 0 to 50% in your opinion. So there we are, look at that, that's fantastic. So it's building up a picture, and I was really hopeful there that it was going to be to some extent or wholly And in fact, there's a few not at alls there. There we are. So to some extent. So that should be what I'm going to do in a moment when you finish, give you a few moments to make your presence felt, and then we will, right, okay, I think people have stopped voting now. So I'm going to close that. I'm going to share the results with you so you can see what I can see here. And as you can see, if we say, okay, well, to some extent, and being generous and saying, well, that's about half and half. Now that picture is probably the reverse of a picture you would have seen, or not the reverse, but a different picture you would have seen 5 years ago. In 5 years ago, 73% wouldn't have been outcome-based, probably. 10 years ago, about 100% would have been outcome-based. And yet we've been talking about this roughly since probably the dawn of time, actually, across the public sector. And it's only really since the one outstanding example is the way that Scotland as a country has decided to look at outcomes and to take it into legislation. And I think that's influenced a lot of other people, although we've had in social services in England and across the UK outcomes for a long time. And I'll show you some examples which go back even further than most of us have been at, in the workforce. So I'm just going to close that question now. And let's go on to, we might have all the questions out of the way because they can be, help us, give us a bit of insight into who's around. There's 3 more questions, just want to get an insight. And so the first question was about your strategic plan, and now it's bringing a bit back to your own businesses, if you like. So if you're in a NHS organisation, we talked about strategically using outcomes. What about the actual day-to-day business? So is business planning done based on outcomes? So what I'm trying to do is bring it back a bit. So again, you've got those 3 kind of questions, wholly based on outcomes, to some extent, not at all. And this I think would be interesting to see. Though we can't get the word. The word of the week, by the way, team, is granularity. Granularity is the word of the week. Everybody is using it. So we won't get quite the granularity. But I think we're getting something interesting here. Right, now then. I'm just trying to work out, we have a bijou gathering today, so we've got 39 people. So 12% of 39 people is 4 of you are wholly outcome-based. The rest of you are about half and half, mostly. But you see, if I just close this now and if I share it with you, you'll find that what you've got there is 18% not at all. Now, if my memory is correct, the answer to the first question, are you strategically very outcome-y? Very few of you were in the not at all bracket. That's to say, I think actually it was about 4 or 5 people, so therefore whatever it would be, less than 10%, I think it was actually in the first question, correct me if I'm wrong. And yet here we have about twice as many of you, when it comes to the operational level, the business planning level, are not actually outcome based, which is very interesting, isn't it? Because that suggests that maybe we're talking about it, we're talking good fight, but we're not actually delivering it. So let me just now just carry on down to, I'm going to skip a question and come back to it. And I'm going to ask you a question, are individuals targets? So now what I'm going to ask you is, we talked about strategically, we talked about the business, what about you personally? Do you feel your individual targets and appraisals are all outcome based? Do you think, you know, when you sit down with your manager, we discuss outcomes? Right, so that's quite interesting. It's some people are outcome based. Oh, quite a lot. So that's about 10 of you, according to this, 25%. Oh no, it's gone down. It's gone down. Ah, I see. It's a dynamic thing. Dynamic thing. I'm assuming that the 15% of you who haven't voted are all too weak to raise your fingers to the thing, and therefore I'm going to vote. So I'm going to cut it off at 85%. Oh, 87. Well done, that person. You just got in time. what I'm going to do is just show you this picture. Now, you remember we started off with 4% not at all at the strategic level. Then we got up to, less than 10% not at strategic level who were not at all interested. Then we got up to 18% at the business level. And guess what happens here? It goes up again. And what you've got there, individually, 29% of you feel that it's not at all. It's quite brilliant to see that at the top there, a quarter of you think that it's you're wholly assessed on outcomes, and in the middle, half of you, so that's really good news. But it is fascinating, that bottom figure, because here we have strategically okay outcomes are the best thing since sliced bread. In business level, yeah, outcomes are there, and there's, we're working on it. And then individually, there's areas where it's not happening, and that's quite interesting. And that's partly to do with one of the wonderful things is to do with impact. May as well ask the last question now. Question 4, then we can get the questions out of the way. And this question is for parents and older siblings from Scotland only, really, because I think there's probably only Scotland that's going to be able to answer this question. So this one says, are financial resources aligned to outcomes? What do you think in your organisation? Do you think that there's some kind of budgeting-y stuff going on? Do you think there's kind of financial, oh dear, it doesn't look good to start with. It's getting worse and worse. I can tell you, by the way, that as of 2000, the last big review of the Scottish outcome national performance framework, any kind of alignment was not there really. And we've got 2/3 of you voted. The rest of you are trying to. We need to make this voting much easier. It's just clearly too difficult for some people to do this voting. It's going up a bit. Excellent. So, judging by that, there's about 8 people haven't voted. Right, so there's 8 don't knows. So let's just close this, and I'm going to share this with you. And remember this question here, saying, okay, how much, to what extent is finance aligned? And as you can see, what we've got here is only 50% wholly, and again, that middle bit, which is obviously a bit blurry, 60%-ish to some extent, but 20% not at all, 26%. So a quarter of organisations wouldn't be aligned at all. And this is the next step on. So when you start thinking about outcomes, most of us are thinking about outcomes at a strategic level, and are thinking about outcomes to make clear what it is we do for a living. Hopefully then that comes into the operational level, and hopefully it comes into individual level. But it's much more difficult to get it into the financial level, if you like, the alignment. And that was the part that we are highlighting on the slide in front of you, that budgets aligned to the enablers. That's a mature thing. So what most of us, most times when I do consulting in this, most time I talk to organisations, help them work through all this, we're still at this earlier stage. It takes some years to get over the idea that you need to be working on outcomes for various reasons, which I'll come to as we go through. So let's move on now from that to trying to give us a feel for what we are, where these outcomes come from. So here is the example that all the Scots amongst you will be familiar with. This is the National Performance Framework from Scotland. You've got a governmental purpose there. You've got high-level targets, which essentially equate to longer-term outcomes. So underneath the word participation, for instance, there's a series of explanations which are longer-term outcomes. Strategic objectives, again, another set of outcomes. And here we have these way in which these are phrased, way in which these statements are phrased is really, really important to me. I work a lot with organisations to get this right, to get it clear in people's minds what we are talking about. When we're talking about an outcome, we are talking about something we are aspiring to, and it may not have happened. So we live in Scotland's most attractive place for doing business in Europe. Well, Scotland, you could argue, is not at the moment the most attractive place for doing business in Europe, because the outcome that you're aiming to impact upon is that it becomes the most attractive place for doing business in Europe. So why not say we want Scotland to be the most attractive place for doing business in Europe? And the answer is because that then isn't an outcome. That is an aspiration. That in terms of, that is more of a sort of a strategy that you are trying to achieve. It's in fact a verb. It's a doing word. It turns the whole thing into a pathway towards something, and not actually the place that you've arrived at. And the place that you arrived at, the result, is the outcome you're aiming at. And you can see it's all phrased in the same way. So that's our familiar set from Scotland that we've come across. I'm sure lots of you have come across before. Here's the, going further down, here's the measurement set that goes with it. So we've got all those perfect purpose targets here. And you can see here is where you start talking about increases or reductions, And you can also start to see the way that you can get more tangible the further down you get. But for instance, just picking up one, and the first of those indicators on the top, on the bottom left, where it says increase in number of businesses, without some narrative, the danger is, of course, that people feverishly go about increasing the number of businesses without thinking through what outcome they're trying to achieve. Now, with the Scottish system here, with any of these outcome frameworks, what you've got is a link between those businesses and something like, for instance, improvements in productivity. And if we go backwards, then it goes up to a safer, stronger, wealthier, fairer, whatever it is, government, and it achieves the government purpose because there's a narrative that connects all these things together. And that's why it's important to have this in a proper narrative and outcome framework rather than a sort of set of randoms. In Scotland, this is all enacted into law. The interesting bit for us, I think, is the middle bit, the second bullet point down. A vision for Scotland will be developed in consultation with the people in Scotland, and progress will be measured so we know whether or not we're achieving it. So you can see that's the purpose of the framework is very much about measuring progress of government in Scotland. That's what it's trying to do. And by doing that, you're leveraging all the other parts of the state to work towards the Scottish Government's aim. One of the problems about measurement and why people hate them and moan about targets imposed from the centre is that these are rough and ready instruments to get people to change their policy. And the answer is, well, tough, because no one's ever invented anything better for a national government to impose its will on, say, bits of the NHS, bits of social services, bits of local government, than targets by saying you will achieve these targets. At least in the Scottish sense, although those are sometimes phrased as targets, they are actually part of a cohesive thinking process, and each of the indicators is connected together. So even if it is a measurement process, it's still a fairly good thing. Here's the latest example. This is a Northern Ireland example I've come back to. This is the Programme for Government outcome framework. So this is explicitly talking about outcomes. Learned a lot from the Scottish experience. You can see, again, we have a more equal society when they patently at the moment in Northern Ireland. It's not necessarily an equal society, and it's something that the Northern Ireland executive is wants to achieve, and by achieving all these outcomes, this is just a subset of them, then it will achieve the government's purpose. And again, you've got these reduce, increase, improve indicators, which all, when they're put together against the outcomes, can give a picture about whether or not you're achieving your purpose as government. In terms of the Irish, Northern Irish Programme for Government framework, there's a couple of things to pick up on. One is the use of language, and we've got the second bullet point down. I like, this is just lifted from the document. Focus on the impact of our people, on our people, rather than the actions we take in government. Exactly, that's what we should be doing, and that's what outcomes encourage you to do. So they encourage a psychological shift in thinking. That's why they're so useful to begin with, is to focus on getting people to think differently and don't worry too much about the financial alignment. I know we're talking from CIFA, but don't worry about that. It's something of a red herring anyway. That's what we can deal with. CFOs can deal with all that. What we need to deal with at the strategic level is getting an understanding of how we can have the maximum, optimum impact on people. The bottom bit as well is, again, emphasising the idea, engaging outside government to develop plans, recognise various parts of many organisations sector have to play, which is a really important point, again, because it goes back to partnership. Because government doesn't do very much. Government sets the environment for job creation, for improvements in quality of life and so on. The idea of government doing things directly was always a fairly flawed one. So outcomes, again, fit into a better way of looking at what the focus of government is. Something of the granddaddy of them all was Virginia Performs. This was the Commonwealth of Virginia, and you can see there's a website at the bottom there. You can have a look at it. This is a scorecard, as they call them in the States, big on scorecards. They spent for a lot of time in the mid-2000s developing this, using an outcome approach, because in 1993 the Government Performance Results Act in the United States said that the federal government ought to be start having strategic plans, basically outcome plans, and the Commonwealth of Virginia was one of the states that followed about 10 years later. I once bumped into a guy who was talking on a platform in, I think it was in Belfast actually, with, there was me, there was a guy from, I think it could have been Chastelaine actually, the bomb bloke, the arms guy from Northern Ireland, the Canadian, and Bill Bratton, oh no, I can't be Bill Bratton, anyway, the guy who was the Commonwealth of Virginia's Controller General, and he was a big tough ex-Marine. And he retired, and he was kind of consulting for the government of Scotland. And I said, so we were sort of queuing up for lunch, and I said, so actually that stuff you were talking about, to what extent actually does it work in Virginia? And he said, well, he said, I've been there for 8 years, and he said, I'm just beginning to get it going now. So he was a guy who was had total executive control over Virginia. He had the full backing of the governor of Virginia. Virginia, like most states, is not that big. It's kind of like in terms of the complication of running it, and yet it took them 8 years to get to the point where they were quite confident that it vaguely looked about right and gave the taxpayers of Virginia and the politicians a feeling that government was a price worth paying. Which actually was the motto. I remember he talked about government was a price worth paying. We've got to justify ourselves. So that's another example. If you want to go look this side of the pond, go and look at things like the national parks authorities. They've been outcome-based for ages, and they even when you tender for work for them, they have an outcome approach to tendering for work. Easy to do if you're a national park, you can argue, because it's just one kind of system producing one kind of set of outcomes, which is true. So that's why they're quite good at it. You can do it much more easily if you've got something fairly easy to scope. Although, of course, all the outcomes for a national park, or most of the outcomes, tend to be very intangible, and that's why an outcome approach works so well with them, because it's going to be difficult to measure them in a conventional way. So there's a bit of a sort of outcome run through of all the stuff. Now let's get through into, okay, what should you do? A couple of ways of doing this. This is how I go about it. You can either start at the beginning or start where you are. If you start at the beginning, what I mean is with a blank sheet of paper, start where you are. What I mean there is you generally end up starting with measures. Here's the blank bit of paper, and I always give people, actually it's got a picture on it, it's got a picture of a swimming pool. And I say to people, tell me about all the outcomes you can think of associated with this, and they come out with all the usual suspects, Olympic medals, well-being, depending on the audience, all those sorts of things. Quite a few of them start talking to me about the keeping the water warm and stuff, which of course is not an outcome. That's just something you do as part of an enabler which will achieve all these things. And from the responses I get, I can draw up something like this. And what you've got on the screen there is a kind of a proto-outcome map, and you've got long-term outcomes, which would be health and well-being, and this one would be mid-term, might be someone learning to swim. And there'll be other factors like the local economy or something like that, or whether or not the Olympics has just been staged in London and everyone wants to become a swimmer, Mark Spitz or something. The tricky bit is with outcomes is these two down here. Early outcomes. People tend to get obsessed about the longer term stuff, the strategic stuff, but in fact actually what you need is you need to think about, well, what are the earliest outcomes that happen as a result of me building a swimming pool and operating a swimming pool, and the answer is people become aware that you have a swimming pool, and then they might engage with your swimming pool, and then they might learn to swim, and then they might become long-term healthy. The point I'm making here is that these early outcomes are probably easy to measure. Also, these arrows that connect these earlier outcomes are probably more accurate than the arrows up here where you're saying, okay, people learn to swim and as a result they become healthier in later life. Those connections are less easy to demonstrate. These connections are generally easier to demonstrate, and that will become important in a minute. The other point is everything on this should be, everything on this picture should be an outcome. So anything that isn't an outcome shouldn't be on the picture to start with. So just get a definition of outcomes and roughly place them like this: longer term, mid-term, and the early outcomes. And then once you've done that, you can start sort of connecting them together. When you're defining outcomes, here's the slide. You can come back to this later, but it's very simple. ABC, as far as I'm concerned, it's an attitudinal or behavioral change by some specific individual or group. If you can't pin it down to that, you haven't got an outcome, you've just got some vague, mushy statement. And those outcomes come about as a result of activities of public, private, third sector bodies and other factors. It's very important that beyond the direct control, i.e. external. Now, for all you financiers out there, that might become a bit of a problem because you're saying, well, hang on, we don't have any outcomes beyond our external control. Well, yes, you do, because the behaviours of budget holders are your key outcomes. So your budget holders, your decision makers, boards of strategists, all make better decisions and direct the resources of the organisation better as a result of the intervention of finance. So finance's outcomes are outside, beyond the direct control of finance. Anything within finance is not an outcome. Now, I've had tedious arguments with people about this. In fact, I've given up arguing with them because it's pointless generally, but you get the arguments that say things like, well, for instance, me maintaining, the other day someone said, me maintaining a electoral role, surely that's sort of adding value and that's an outcome. And the answer is, well, no, not really, is it? Because that's some stuff you create which, if it has some outcome later on beyond the organisation, is useful. But within the organisation, it's not terribly useful unless it's used, unless it has an impact on an outcome. And the other point is it's not the only possible result. An outcome is a probabilistic statement. So you're saying, we will be the best place to do business in Europe. And so in a sense, you've got this two possibilities that might come out of this. So here's the stuff you do, the pyramid, here's the arrow. And here's the good stuff, which is the saint on the left-hand side. That's what you want to happen, but it's quite possible that you will not become the best place to do business in Europe. In fact, you will become a worse place to do business, possibly beyond your own reach. Possibly it's nothing to do with you, but possibly it is to do with the fact that your reasoning, represented by these arrows, is flawed. So what you're doing down here at the tangible level, at the enabler level, is the wrong thing to do, and you're having the wrong effect. This brings us to the other point about outcomes. Outcomes are about risk management as well, because what you're trying to do is identify an acceptable set of outcomes and manage your business to deliver an acceptable set of outcomes. That is what risk management is. So unless you actually develop and identify these outcomes in the future, and particularly what these worse outcomes are that you are trying to mitigate, you're trying to do something about and reduce, then you're not properly risk managing the business, at least at a strategic level, if not at a tactical level. So now we've got, what have we got? We've got a definition here of what our outcomes are. and we've got, just going back a slide, he said, going back a slide, there we are, we've got a picture of these outcomes. A bigger picture, more clearer picture, if you like, can be represented by a tree diagram. Here we have the fruits and the foliage, which represent the outcomes. Here we have the trunk, and we have the roots. Now the trunk and the roots are the key outcomes, so these are the sort of key enablers, rather, would be around the trunk, which directly deliver some outcome. And here further down you've got these enablers which have to be there in order to support other enablers. So the left-hand side box here could be the financial enabler, then you've got in the middle, it could be the IT, could be the HR, in a traditional sort of almost kind of scorecard picture. You'll see there's a bit of space. What's the space for? Space is for other factors. So there could be other things that you should be identifying on your outcome picture, and you can see that without those other factors, we have a deficiency here in that this enabler is not actually delivering anything. But as soon as you put the other factor in place, then what happens is that right, there we are. The other factor in place, then this is actually delivering it. So by itself, it is not sufficient to deliver. These connections on this kind of picture are very important. You end up discussing them for a long time between groups of people because they represent the theory of change, or they represent your strategic theory for how you think doing this arrives at this stuff here. So how do you think these enablers deliver these outcomes? Or more precisely, how do you think achieving the key strategic mission level outcomes up here are preceded by other outcomes, preceded by very early outcomes, which are impacted upon by your enablers? If you start at the top of this picture and work downwards, this set of green stuff here is not necessarily your hospital. It's not necessarily your local authority. It's not necessarily your Welsh Assembly services. It could be a completely different configuration of enablers that will still deliver the outcomes, or in fact are better placed to deliver the outcomes. So when you do this for the first time, my recommendation is always start with the green stuff and go to the outcome stuff, because otherwise you'll just be with a huge psychological battle on your hands where everybody realizes that when they start with the outcomes and work downwards, then their job disappears. Or not their job disappears immediately, but ultimately their job could be under threat. Let's move on. Constructing these pictures, for heaven's sake, make sure you've got the right people in the room. Think about the stakeholders you've got. When you're first doing the drafting of these kind of pictures, you don't necessarily want the big players in, but you at least need to know what the big players ought to be thinking about. And at some point, you're going to have to take it to the players anyway, so you need to think about how you're going to take it to the players. You don't need just this tree picture alone, these picture of these interactions alone. What you need is a narrative. You need a story. So you need to be absolutely sure about what story you're going to take to the players. You want to ask them things about, or ask yourselves things about, what's the salience of the issues involved to the stakeholders. Salience is, of course, the word meaning, gosh, this is terribly important to the exclusion of everything else today, as I'm a politician. Yes, it wasn't terribly salient to me yesterday, and it probably won't be salient to me the day after. So you, as an analyst, need to think about how you're going to manage that salience to people. Think about outcomes, expectations, implicit, explicit. Think about their favoured measures. People see the world through measures. If you've got somebody who's an engineer, they're bound to want tangible measures. A financier will want financial measures. If you don't actually think about indicators that help them to understand outcomes in terms of either those tangible measures or financial measures, then they ain't going to engage necessarily. And people, in my experience, have pet measures. So you end up having what is a sensible outcome picture with sensible outcome measures and indicators, and then you have the odd bizarre one because councillor so-and-so is obsessed by whatever it is that the bizarre thing comes to. As long as everyone in the room knows that that actual measure is only there to placate a particular stakeholder, it doesn't really matter. Here's an example of how you can take something apart and put it into a picture. Here we have a picture of the an excerpt from the Northern Ireland Programme for Government here, and as you can see, it's very, very wordy stuff indeed, fantastically wordy stuff, well, fantastic and wordy, beautifully written, just in case anyone listening to me has written it. However, let's just extract from it. It's got an outcome, it's got a role of executive, it's got the indicators. Let me go to my simple picture of the same thing. So what we've got here is we've got the outcome on the top right-hand side. We've got all the stuff the executive thinks it's going to do. We've got these arrows. These arrows represent the executive's theory about how doing whatever it is, say tackling poverty and deprivation, arrives at the outcome at the top there, outcome 4. You'll notice I put a thing there about wicked monsters, here being wicked monsters, because in most of these summary documents, and this is why summary documents, wordy documents, don't do outcomes justice. In most of them, there is no progression of outcomes. So if this is the boundary of the organisation here, this dotted line, what we should see here, just over, is an early outcome, and then we should have a medium level outcome. And only then will we get the higher level outcome. At the moment, it looks like what's going to happen is that people in Northern Ireland are going to enjoy longer, healthy, active lives simply by this stuff happening. And you and I know that that ain't true. Something early has to happen. People have to engage with the program. Once they're engaged with the program, they have to stick with the program. Once they stick with the program, they've got to do something else, and so on and so forth. So actually, you need a kind of richer map than the one that's represented here, but it's a good start. And what this does, of course, what this is it's simply a rewriting of this original. So in another notation. One of the things that people say to me sometimes about outcomes is say, okay, well, you're talking about connections and these arrows that connect things. Can I put a head to the arrow at either end, because they're sort of codependent, because the thing at the top of the arrow here actually also affects the thing at the bottom of the arrow? And the answer is no. If you want to do that, have another arrow. And the reason for that is very simple. I'm going to try and explain this on this slide here, and it is that this arrow, the arrow that we're looking at there, means that the things that we believe, shows that we believe the thing at the base of the arrow causes or contributes to the thing at the top of the arrow. Now this is important. That arrow is not just simply something you just slapdash down on the map to make it look pretty. It is actually explaining your belief in the connection, the cause and effect pathways through the map. And if you don't get that right, then it comes, you come a cropper straight away. And this is why, for instance, where you sometimes see forms where people say, right, can you draw an outcome map, and here's a 3-column table or something, and on the right-hand side there's the longer-term outcomes, and there's the medium-term, and there's the early outcomes, which is all very well, and all you do is list them down, but you don't have the connections. Now, the reason the connections are so important is when it comes to measurements, as you all know, that if you measure a thing at the bottom of the arrow, it predicts the occurrence of the thing at the top of the arrow, because you're saying, well, this thing at the bottom of the arrow exists, then the thing at the moment, the thing at the top of the arrow will exist in future. So therefore, if I measure what's going on here, it tells me what will happen in future over here. And remember, outcomes exist in the future. Risk exists in the future. So if you get connection right, you can go forward. And similarly, if you look at the outcome here, if this is an outcome at the top here, you can say, well, if I can measure that outcome in some way, it will tell me whether or not the thing at the bottom of the outcome, which could be an enabler, is actually working as I planned it to work. Or whether or not, for instance, I'm doing it in all the sites I thought I was doing it at. It was very interesting to read the article today about the Scottish national curriculum again, where the most successful schools are circumventing the curriculum, according to the Times this morning. They are sort of giving it lip service, but they're doing their own thing. And that's quite interesting, because what you look at the national level, you say, well, is this outcome happening of children's PISA levels rising? And then when you go back, well, what it's telling you is that no, it's not happening. But when you go back and look at the data, I'm willing to bet that it's going to be tricky to work out which schools are cheating and which schools aren't cheating. because there ain't proper connections that have been made in that map. It's just assumed that if you have a national curriculum, schools will do the right thing. Anyway, let's get away from political stuff and just carry on where we are. Data or conviction. I want data about whether or not the connection between those two things exists. I'd also like conviction. That's to say, what I want is, I want an officer in local authorities or civil servant to say, Minister, I'm willing to bet my pension that this map is correct. And that's what I want. I want conviction. I want people to say, this is my theory of change. I believe in this theory of change. It's my expert opinion, having done a lot of work on this. Bring along conviction to start with, preferably both, which means back it up by data. But at the beginning of a new theory of change, you won't have the data. You might have a data collection plan, but you won't have historical data. Test all this, and again I'll leave this slide. Obviously it'll be in a pack for you, so have a go back and look at it. This is my checklist that I always start with. Whip out this checklist when talking about those arrow connections. We talk about things about, and the reason there's a picture of an egg there, because that's it's all about a chicken and an egg situation sometimes, is that would that outcome have come about even if the enabler wasn't there? And these are all the tests that you do. And they're all pretty familiar, I'm sure. They are based, all the Scottish people watching this, since you're all schooled with John Locke, you'll know exactly what this comes from. It comes obviously from his essay on concerning human understanding, and cause and effect. So I'll leave you to ponder all that. Narrative or story, I've mentioned this before. It doesn't matter what it is, just needs to be convincing, needs to be true. Or needs to have conviction behind it and a promise to find the data which either conforms or denies that it's a true story. So if you're saying, I think that by doing this work in this way, we will have this impact in future on an outcome, then that's my narrative, but I'm going to collect data that tries to disprove my theory as well as prove my theory. So again, it can be totally useful. It's also about cascading that last bullet point, making sure that you can communicate this. If you have just the map by itself, it won't communicate much. You need the map and you need the story to communicate that. So that was starting from a blank sheet of paper. Most of you are probably starting from measurement. So you ask the basic questions, and this slide sort of just takes us through the sort of basic questions. Again, it's a kind of reference for you. You ask, what this data is valuable for, why people are using it. All those sort of basic questions are always terribly useful. You'll probably have different answers depending on who you ask. Leaders wanting resource planning, managers wanting to improve, politicians wanting to hold organisations to account. There's probably some overlap, as it says there, but that's the kind of the first thing to understand. Then what you do is you go through and what they say in drag racing circles, run what you've run. And what that means is that you start with what you've got, and what you've got is a load of performance data. Some of it measurements are good, some of it bad, and what you do is, having asked the question of the stakeholders what they want the information for, then what you can do is start to look at all your data, put it through a sieve, and think which bits do we keep, which bits do we need to adjust, which bits essentially can we kick out and stop going forward. What you're looking for is, it says there are all sorts of things like unaddressed questions that customers find value or will find value in the future. So just because you ask a customer, say, when I say customer and stakeholder, talking to them say about some health intervention, saying what would make your life better, it's unlikely they'll be sufficiently expert to understand the answer to that question, if they understand the question even. Because what's going on here is that people only know what they know at the moment. Very clearly, people do not know what they do not know. But a professional might know what they do not know, or a group of people might know what they do not know. So essentially, one of the things you've got to be careful about is when you're setting up performance, sitting through the performance information, you don't kick out stuff that might be useful in future. The other thing about performance information, building up a picture of performance information using an outcomes approach, is to think about questions. Now, what this means is that think about questions that your stakeholders who use the information need to address, need to answer, need to be talking about. And questions are very good things, because questions tend to go in one ear, go through the mind, and then come out the mouth. If you just tell people stuff like, here's a performance indicator, Alderman Smith, that says, you know, there's so many people are breathing in toxic fumes, that doesn't tell us much. What you might say is, to what extent is the air quality improving in the borough? That's a question, and then the answer might be, or one of the answers might be, your collections of data about toxicity in the air. But it wouldn't be the only answer. It wouldn't be the only piece of data. And it's still going around in that Alderman Smith's mind, because it's a question that he should be thinking about. And the questions are the way we change outcomes into usable data. So we start with fuzzy outcomes, and then we say, well, what questions should I ask about those fuzzy outcomes? And then I look for the data I'm already collecting and say, well, does any of the data I collect at the moment actually help me to answer that question? So the question is, how do you work out the questions? Well, it's dead simple. What you do is you get your outcome map. Here's an outcome map on the left-hand side of this picture here, and on the bottom you've got enablers. And what you simply do is you paraphrase the outcomes and enablers. Now, what this means is, for instance, in fact, if I just click over to the next slide, just give you an example. I know there's some from Welsh Police here, and I remember this was done with South Wales Police some years ago, about 5 years ago, I think, when the Home Office was banging around and saying, okay, here's a bunch of outcomes, here's what we want you to achieve. And so what we've got is an outcome. Communities are not affected by antisocial behaviour. And so what happened was that the discussion went through, okay, what questions should we be asking around that outcome? Once you've got the questions around that outcome, and as you can see, once you've got the questions about that outcome, oh, I've just dropped someone's question, I'll come back to it in a minute. Once you've got the questions about that outcome, then we can look at what data happen to be knocking around the force, and that enabled us then to say, okay, well, let's collect this data because it addresses this question, which the police leadership team should be discussing around about that outcome. And similarly, on the right-hand side of the picture, you've got, there was a thing about, we thought that one of the reasons for antisocial behaviour was prolific and priority offenders. So the question was, okay, rather than just measuring the number of them in the area, you'd start asking questions. And here's a simple question about it: how well are disruption of work operations working? And the indicators were this. So what's happening here, the questions are acting as a bridge between the outcomes or the enablers and the indicators. And what this does is it makes sure you're focusing on the right thing and make sure you're connecting these indicators to the outcomes. Now, I'm just going to oh, I thought I was answering that question. We've lost the question. Have we lost the question? No, we've got a question. Someone will get back. Don't worry, we haven't lost your question. It's just me. Yeah, okay, right, down there. And question, given resources are scarce, do we need to map out the outcomes from services that may be divested in to free up resources for allocation? Yes, you do. I'll show you why in a moment. Because when you're contracting them out, you might want to map them out. So it's a yes-ish, whoever asked that question. It doesn't say who asked that question. David Walton, forgive me. Yeah, David. I'll just come to that in a moment because I'm just going to talk, I'm just going to go on to this slide here, which is commissioning, which is exactly your question in a way, is if we're going to commission, i.e. get rid of stuff or get someone else to do it, you can use outcome maps to, for instance, if you've got a smart set of commissioners, as in, sorry, a smart set of deliverers who you think are up to it, you can say, hey, this is our long-term outcome or mission level outcome, you work out the outcome map for us. You tell us what your theory of change is, you tell us what you're going to do for us. And then what they do is that they'll build up a picture for you of all the benefits. So essentially what they're doing is saying, okay, this stakeholder must see this benefit, and guess what, a benefit's very similar to an outcome. So they're going to say, okay, well this stakeholder will see this benefit, they'll learn to swim, they'll then feel fitter, and then then as a result of that, well-being will increase, and the enabler is we'll build you a swimming pool and operate it for you. Okay, so that's one way of doing it if you've got a very sophisticated commissioner. The other way of doing it is if you haven't got a sophisticated commissioner, is you still need an outcome map, but then what you do is you say, okay, how are you going to actually have the maximum impact, maximum bang per buck on my on the outcomes that I want. So I don't know. I hope that's given you a quick answer there, David, to that. But also for everybody else, these two slides are illustrating what's happening now more and more. Is people are thinking about using outcomes for commissioning because it's a good way of explaining precisely what it is you want to contractors or potential contractors, and also to partners and people in your delivery chain, because all of these outcome maps will include people in the delivery chain. So yes, you do have to do it, but you need to be intelligent about doing it. You don't want to have outcomes maps for everything everywhere. If it's blindingly obvious stuff, don't have one for it. Having said that, very few things, of course, in government are blindingly obvious. Summary. How would I summarise in the few minutes that we've got available? Don't just measure there. Get up and think about it. What a witty joke that's about. And really, it's saying, look, don't leap straight into the measures if you can avoid it. Don't look at your own measures at all if you can avoid it. Start with the outcome map and get a story together, a narrative. Then think about what questions people should be asking around this. And then use questions as a filter for looking at the indicators. Once you get that, then you can look at and then think about, well, what actions could you improve? So how can you improve the enablers? But the big prize is not improving what you're doing at the moment. The big prize is improving your theory of change, improving the outcome map, saying actually this outcome pathway is not the right pathway, and therefore the way we've configured our local authority or NHS trust or whatever it is at the moment is not an appropriate way. There are better ways to do it, better ways to achieve value for money, better ways to have an impact which has a real social impact on these outcomes. So the big thing is not just improving the actions, which is just improving what you're doing day to day, that's the enablers. It's changing the map entirely. So keeping intact the mission level outcomes that you want, but changing everything else. And the last thing, well, a couple of last things, is always start at the bottom of the map, work outwards, so as not to scare the horses to start with, but challenge backwards. So once you've got it there, and everyone says, oh yes, this is the configuration of my service at the moment, and this is what it delivers in outcome terms, you say, that's fantastic. Can we just now work backwards? And you say things like, okay, this long-term outcome, are we sure this happens, these middle outcomes happen just before that? And are they necessary? Are they sufficient? And then what you do is when you're working backwards like that, is you're saying, why do you think this is true? Why do you think this is true? Why do you think this is true? All the way backwards. And then ultimately you'll get to the point where you realise actually a lot of the stuff you do at the moment needs changing in one way or another. Still some major issues. And those of you who've seen any seminar I've done for years and years, I'm just going to put the risk putting the camera back on for this last bit of the slide, so just so you can see that we're still interested. Look, our colleagues are also interested in what's going on here. Type 1 and Type 2 is one of the interesting things here. I'm just sorry, the camera's not. I'm just going to use my hands to explain Type 1 and Type 2. Well, Type 1 and Type 2 is, you've probably seen before if you've seen any of the webinars I've done. Type 1 is my metaphor for simple, straightforward problems. And that's where you probably don't need an outcome map because the theory of change is very straightforward. Where you've got really complex, so for instance, building a bridge. Okay, I need to build a bridge, new further force, crossing, Type 1 problem, very complicated. I mean, you have to be a bridge builder to do it, but on the other hand, not very complex. Tricky thing is the Type 2 part, where it's much more about wicked issues, where you really do need some kind of outcome map to look, for instance, at the economic development of the Fife region as a result of having 2 road crossings, and now Amazon has moved out of where it used to be, and the council has moved into where Amazon was, and the schools are in the wrong place, and the roads are in the wrong, all that sort of stuff. So simple, building a bridge. Tricky, dealing with the economic effect on the whole of Fife. Contribution, always going to be tricky. Getting other agencies to work together, always tricky. Funding, incentives, payment, pensions, all that sort of stuff. How the NHS is recruited and incentivised is different from how local government is recruited and incentivised. So if my colleagues from the Welsh Assembly are still here, you'll know how difficult that is to sort out. Again, actually just sorting out central local government, getting them to work in the same way, because again the incentives are different at the individual level and the budget level. Linking finance and performance, I think it's a bit of a red herring, actually. That's a terrible thing to say, but it's true, because you'll spend too much time worrying about that. Once you've got the outcome stuff in place, outcome maps in place and incentives and indicators in place, it's much easier to start thinking about that. So don't worry about that to start with. Spend some years getting the other bit right, and then start thinking, well, very basic thing, well, on balance, are we putting percentage-wise the right chunk of budget? Does it feel right in the right areas? Measures need to be inaccurate as possible. Another one of my sayings all the time is you need to be as inaccurate as possible. And what that means is, if you've asked your decision makers what kind of questions they need to ask, and if, for instance, they need to ask a question that has an answer, well, is it rising or is it going up or going down? That all you need to provide is data that shows it's going up or going down. You do not need to provide massively accurate data and waste all the time. You can have much more real-time analysis with inaccuracy, but it's a special kind of inaccuracy. It's an inaccuracy based on exactly what the client wants. And the client in this case are the decision makers and the politicians. I think that's about it. I think I'm a minute over. So if there are any questions, we're willing to wait any more questions, or if you all rush back to work, then maybe there won't be any questions. So I don't think there are any questions at the moment. These slides will be up in the next few days, and there's a PDF, I think, of the actual material.
So the recording will be on the website.
The recording will be on the website. So there we are. So you can get this information. You can always come through us and contact me directly if you want more and more of this information. We're always willing to give these slides. You know, you can have copies of these things if you need them. I hope that was useful, and I hope that if we ran this, for instance, in another 5 years, then most of you will be working in strategic outcome organisations. Business planning is done on an outcome basis, individual planning is done on an outcome basis, and all your finances are entirely aligned with outcomes. Won't happen, but it'd be a nice idea. So thank you for that, and until our next webinar, and as I say, I do hope you have a good day.